Welcome to Flippening, the first and original podcast for full-time, professional, and institutional crypto investors. I'm your host, Clay Collins. Each week we discuss the cryptocurrency economy, new investment strategies for maximizing returns, and stories from the front lines of financial disruption. Go to flippening.com to join our newsletter for cryptocurrency investors and find out just why this podcast is called Flippening.
Clay Collins is the CEO of Nomics. All opinions expressed by Clay and podcast guests are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinion of Nomics or any other company. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon as the basis for investment decisions.
Welcome to this conversation with Hasu, who is an anonymous cryptocurrency researcher who writes for Uncommon Core and Deribit Insights. This episode was recorded in front of a live audience. If you'd like to attend a live Flippening podcast recording and directly submit interview questions to guests, then please go to flippening.com and subscribe. After you have subscribed, we'll be sure to send you email notifications before live recording sessions so you can join us. Space is limited to 100 attendees per recording, so go to flippening.com to subscribe and join us for the next live recording of this podcast. With this established, let's get back to our guest presenter. Hasu is one of the foremost researchers in the crypto space, and he used to be a professional poker player. This is actually relevant. As Hasu explains, there's quite a bit of overlap between poker and cryptoeconomics. Both can be understood through game theory, which is the study of strategic interaction among players who succeed by predicting each other's behavior. Our conversation is split into 4 chapters. In chapter 1, we discuss Hasu's background, both as a poker player and now as a researcher and writer. Chapter 2 is a deep dive on proof of work and Nakamoto consensus. In chapter 3, we'll use game theory to understand the incentives behind proof of work mining. Chapter 4 is a Q&A. We'll take questions from the audience and cover a range of topics, including Bitcoin maximalism, declining block rewards, and how China came to dominate Bitcoin mining. The transcript and show notes for this episode are available at flippening.com/Hasu. We'll get to this episode in just a second, but before we get started, I'd like to pause for a moment to tell you that this episode is brought to you by the good folks at nexo.io. Here's a word from them. Nexo is the only lender offering instant crypto credit lines, which let you use digital assets as collateral to get cash in 45 fiat currencies and stablecoins. You might remember Nexo from episode 64, where we spoke with their co-founder, Antony Trenchev. If you haven't heard this episode, which is episode 64, I highly recommend checking it out as it's one of our most popular episodes to date. And Nexo has a big announcement related to crypto credit lines. Their annual interest rates for credit lines are now starting at just 5.9%, which may very well be the lowest borrowing rate in the whole industry. Nexo is also a strategic partner of exchanges, OTC desks, and crypto funds through its portfolio of structured financial products. Institutional counterparties can earn up to 8% annually on their idle stablecoins, enter into asset swap agreements, or directly borrow crypto. Individuals can also park their cash in stablecoins at Nexo's interest earning account to get an annual return of 8%. What's more, interest is paid out daily and you can add or withdraw funds at literally any time. So if you're looking to borrow, lend, or swap digital assets, Nexo is your go-to partner. Definitely explore nexo.io or reach them at institutions@nexo.io. This episode is also brought to you by cryptotrader.tax. Here are 4 things you should know about them. Number 1, cryptotrader.tax automates the entire crypto tax reporting process and has partnered with the TurboTax team to bring cryptocurrency tax reporting to the mainstream. Number 2, cryptotrader.tax offers a complete tax loss harvesting module to help investors figure out their greatest tax savings opportunities to reduce their taxable income. Number 3, cryptotrader.tax supports all fiat currencies, meaning users from all over the world can use the platform to calculate their gains and losses in their home fiat currency. Finally, number 4, cryptotrader.tax offers a suite for tax professionals to help them manage their cryptocurrency clients. And while I'm not a CPA and not qualified to provide tax advice, I should note that I personally advise my family to never just hand over their cryptocurrency exchange history to a CPA. Instead, I encourage them to let cryptotrader.tax analyze their trade histories, find the tax calculation method that's best optimized to save them money, and then submit summary documents to their accountant. This also saves you from having to pay your accountant to do the tedious work of generating Form 8949 and other similar forms. Creating an account and importing your historical data is completely free. You only pay when you want to download your tax report for the year. Just tell them that Clay from the Flippening podcast sent you to get a discount on your tax reports. So go to cryptotrader.tax to sign up today. Finally, this episode is brought to you by the Nomics API and CSV data export service. If you need an enterprise-grade crypto market data API for your fund, smart contract, or app, Or if you need historical CSV dumps of trading data or crypto market cap data from top exchanges or even obscure ones, then consider trying out the Nomics API or our historical data export service. Just go to nomicsapi.com to learn more or email us at sales@nomics.com. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program. Here's my conversation with Hasu. Enjoy. Let's start with chapter 1, which is a dive into Hasu's background and how he got involved in the cryptocurrency industry. I'd love to discuss a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the space. I know you've got an avatar, and I imagine you might not be using your real name. That said, it would be great to get to know a little bit about you and the origin story of your involvement in this crazy world we call crypto.
Yeah, so I write in my Twitter that I'm a cryptocurrency researcher, but really I just started as someone who's deeply passionate about the idea of private money. And I just found that my skill set and my interests, they map quite well onto this new field. So around 2 years ago, I started reading and talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency all day, and eventually started writing and publishing about it, first on Medium, then moved from Medium to my own blog, uncapping.co, and eventually me and my friend Suzu, who did this blog together with me, we got approached by Deribit to create a sort of equivalent to a BitMEX research, which has done an amazing job publishing open source research in this space, in my opinion. Yeah, they offered us the ability to create Deribit insights. And this is, of course, a dream come true for me. So I managed to turn this passion of just reading and writing about crypto into a full-time job now. This is pretty much the second time that this happened to me, because before cryptocurrency, I played online poker for 10 years.
For how many years?
For 10 years. So,
oh, wow.
One of the longest standing players in that field. Yeah. And as that fizzled out, I had known about Bitcoin for some time, because Bitcoin is actually quite present in the field of online poker and live poker as well, just because it makes it very easy to transfer money around on a global scale. So evading capital controls, moving money between countries, saving on wire fees, that is something that poker players, at least live players who play in different countries, they learn pretty soon. And a lot of the OTC trading in this space is done against Bitcoin and Tether. But I knew Bitcoin would be something that interests me, but I was making money with poker and I did not want any distraction at the time. So I deliberately pushed this away for the time when I decided I would be done with one thing and then fully commit myself to the next thing.
Do you have a formal background in monetary research or monetary policy, sort of asking these types of questions in an academic context, or are you primarily self-taught?
Yeah, I'm entirely self-taught. So I do reuse. When I said my skill set map quite well onto crypto, then I'm talking about things I learned about mathematics, logic, and in particular game theory. So game theory is probably the number one field that you study actively as a poker player.
Oh, so that blends quite well into cryptoeconomics. That's fascinating. So I came across you first through some Medium pieces that you published with Nick Carter. How did you come to know Nick and start collaborating with him?
Yeah, I had been following Nick for some time, a few months, I think. And I was just really impressed with him. I thought he was one of the most intelligent commentators in this space, on Twitter in particular. And I just kept messaging him, not via PM, but just when he tweeted something, I would engage with it, right, and respond. And eventually we started he started responding back, and we just had had more conversations. And I believe one day he sent me, I don't know if I messaged him or if he messaged me, but somehow we got to talk about a particular topic. I think it was about the Ethereum pre-sale. And he just told me that he would love, basically he encouraged me to write about this. And I did. So that was my first article ever published, basically looking at the Ethereum pre-sale from a game theoretic perspective. And what I found at the time was that ICOs pretty much all have a fatal flaw, namely that the issuer can invest in them for free. He can pretty much generate an unlimited amount of tokens for him if he wants to.
Is there a backstory behind your avatar? First off, is that, at first I thought that was Stewie from Family Guy, but I'm pretty sure that's a character from Rick and Morty. Is that right?
So in Rick and Morty, there are several dimensions, right? So it's a multiverse. One of the Mortys, one of the two main characters from Rick and Morty, he is evil. And so that's the evil version of Morty from one of the many universes.
You've published quite a few interesting studies at this point. Some of them are larger, some of them smaller, some of them are a bit more formal. Some of them are, medium pieces, and some of them are on the Deribit blog. Is there a piece that stands out to you as being the most surprising in that not only was the hypothesis that you came with wrong, and perhaps the null hypothesis was also not correct, but it was something completely different from the null hypothesis and your hypothesis going into the research?
Yeah, so I would say that for many of the articles that we released, it was the case that new information came to light later that somehow made us update how we thought about basically the thesis. Interestingly, I don't think that anything that I wrote about was totally invalidated after the fact. So I can look at my work now and still, just looking at the writing style and how I made some of the arguments would make me cringe today for sure, just because I had no prior experience in writing, no idea how to structure an article, etc. when I started around 2 years ago. So I'm telling myself that I got a bit better over time, although still a scrub for sure. The main points that I was trying to make, they held up quite well.
Let's move on to chapter 2, which is about proof of work and Nakamoto consensus. So it's commonly understood that Bitcoin is secured by proof of work mining. But what does that mean? Can you take us through what's happening behind the scenes of proof of work?
So mining and mining related security, I think, even though it's 11 years after Bitcoin's invention, it's still the least understood aspect of the whole thing. And many people will give you wildly different answers to questions like what secures Bitcoin, how dangerous is mining centralization, how much should we worry about specific attacks, and so on. Just so we are on the same page, what does Bitcoin try to do? Bitcoin establishes an open, permissionless ledger, and the state of that ledger, that is basically who owns what in the system, or in other words, Bitcoin's UTXO set. So the UTXO stands for unspent transaction output. And we want anyone to be able to submit updates to that ledger, and transactions in the ledger should be final, at least eventually. So we have some kind of confidence that when we receive money and the transactions in the ledger, that it's not going to just disappear in the future. So these are really the core properties that any digital money system should have. And mining fits into that picture in two ways. So first, mining is used to establish distributed consensus. And second, mining is responsible for the initial coin distribution. All digital money systems basically have a fundamental birth defect, if you will, because digital tokens, unlike physical ones, can be copied. It is not logically possible to prove that a file has been destroyed after sending it. It can just be copied an infinite number of times and be sent to different people. And the result is, unfortunately, that anyone can spend the same coin multiple times. This is called the double spend problem, and it effectively leads to counterfeiting, inflation, and it just generally makes a digital cash system, a really bad time. So any working digital cash system needs to solve the double spend problem, and not just digital cash, just any form of digital money. You can solve it basically in two ways. You can solve it in a centralized way, where you just use a server to track if balances have been spent. And then people can send messages to the server. For example, they can say, I want to spend a coin to Bob. And they can also send message requests to the servers and say, hey, tell me my own balance, right? But the downside with using a central server is all the trust that is involved with it. And it also represents a single point of failure. So the government or the rule of mob comes in and makes certain demands. Maybe the central parties forced to freeze balances or block transactions, for example, to WikiLeaks, or you're not allowed to move your money here or there out of the country. You're not to buy from these and these and these merchants. And this is something that Satoshi really wanted to avoid. Satoshi came up with a decentralized solution. There's still a ledger that tracks unspent balances, but the ledger is stored on multiple servers instead of just one. And you can still write and read requests, write and read requests to any one of them. But once you have more than one server, then you run into another problem, because messages can arrive in different orders at different servers. Imagine a malicious party, Mallory, and she requests to spend a coin to Alice at server 1, and Alice gets a confirmation from that server that she has received the coin. But at the same time, Mallory also spends the same coin to Bob at a second server, and he receives confirmation from the second server. So whose coin is it now? Either these two servers come to some sort of agreement in hindsight, and then Mallory spent counterfeited money, or much more likely, they don't agree, and then the network just splits. So we really need a way for nodes in that network to transition to a new state together. So whatever update one of them makes to their version of the database, we need some kind of assurance that all other nodes in the network make that same update. So they only move in lockstep. And we can get that if the servers together come to consensus before users trust what they read, right? This is very important. One idea would be to have some kind of vote, right? Some kind of election. But the problem with that is you can't really tally up votes the way that you can in the physical world, because there's a very well-known problem with the Sybil problem, or the Sybil attack, where one party can just appear as a much larger number of people online by using different identities, different servers. So there's really no way to prove your personness, if you will, in the digital realm. We need a way to put a weight behind what these servers say. We need a way to import costliness into the digital space. This is what proof of work does. A proof of work is a proof for the digital world that you spend resources in the real world. So in proof of work, miners play in a lottery where they constantly try to bundle state updates. So basically they take a lot of transactions, put it in a block, and then they bundle it with a proof of work. And the proof of work succeeds if the hashed block header is smaller than the current difficulty requirement in the network for that proof of work. And it is checked effectively by looking at with how many zeros does that hash start. And if it starts with sufficiently many zeros, then it serves as a proof of computation. It is accepted basically as a valid block by the other nodes. Imagine that I present to you 10 dice, and all of them have a 6 showing up. And also there's no way for me to have forged this. You look at the dice and you know that I must have rolled them a lot of times to come up with this. To be precise, 6 to the power of 10 times, or 60 million times. And you know every roll costs me a little bit of energy. Then just by showing you that I was able to roll 10 sixes, then that's how you know that I spent a certain amount of energy to get to this result.
That's a really good way of putting it. I've never heard that analogy before. If you can prove that something that's highly unlikely to occur has occurred, then you can trust that you did the work to lead to that conclusion or to get to that end state. That's really interesting.
It is still the only known way how to do a trustless proof of work, pretty much. But proof of work alone does not give you consensus yet. It is just a Sybil control mechanism, but it must be also paired with a chain selection rule. So using the proof of work, you can prove that you did a certain amount of work, but then there's still going to be some protocol for how others ought to interpret that. That rule in Bitcoin is always switch to the longest chain. So in Bitcoin, proof of work plus the longest chain rule, that is what we call Nakamoto consensus. And Nakamoto consensus is Bitcoin's consensus algorithm, not proof of work. In theory, you can have other Sybil control mechanisms as well. So you can have proof of stake, you can have proof of burn, you can have proof of authority, you can have all kinds of new stuff, proof of optic work, proof of space-time, and whatnot. But proof of the original concept of proof of work is still to my knowledge, the only way to trustlessly prove that you expended energy in the real world, and only on that. So proof of stake cannot do this, for example, right? Because stake itself is digital, and there's still the possibility for you to basically sign several branches of a chain with the same stake, because the act of signing itself is not costly. Returning to the idea of Nakamoto consensus, let's look at one full example of how this plays out. So first, users broadcast transactions to miners. Then miners take these transactions, bundle them in a block. Then they take that block, the header of that block, they hash it over and over again with a different nonce. That's sort of like a magic number. They just increase it by 1 every time. And they look for an output to that hashing function that is lower than the current difficulty requirement, right, in the network. Basically, a way to prove that they came up with 10 sixes. And if they find it, then they broadcast it to the network. And then other nodes, both mining and non-mining nodes, see it. They look at the block, they run it against their own validity rules. That means rules that the block does not break any of the important network rules. If it doesn't, and also represents a longer chain, so then they would switch to it. This is reliable because we know the update was expensive to make. And that expense increases with every new block that is mined on top of the block that you care about. So this is what people mean when they say that Bitcoin has probabilistic finality or is eventually consistent, because we really hope that this consensus algorithm maximizes the chance that the many subjective views of our respective databases ultimately converge to one objective view over the long run. That's when you can really trust that your transaction is included in the ledger.
Hey, I wanted to pause for a second and let you know that this episode of the Flippening Podcast is brought to you by our friends at cryptotrader.tax, which makes the excruciating task of reporting your cryptocurrency gains and losses a breeze. Indeed, sorting through transaction records from your exchanges and reporting each trade in US dollar terms is not how most crypto investors want to spend a weekend. Cryptotrader.tax is a software platform that automates the entire cryptocurrency tax reporting process. It's basically like TurboTax for cryptocurrency investors. All you have to do is connect your exchanges and import your trade history into the platform. CryptoTrader.tax will do all of the number crunching and spit out your auto-filled tax reports with the click of a button. Simply give these generated tax forms to your accountant or even import them into your preferred tax filing software like TurboTax or TaxAct. You can join more than 10,000 cryptocurrency investors who are automating their crypto tax reporting with CryptoTrader.tax today. Creating an account and importing your historical data is completely free. You only pay when you want to download your tax report for the year. Just tell them that Clay from the Flippening Podcast sent you to get a discount on your tax reports. This episode is also brought to you by our longtime and trusted partner, Nexo. As someone who personally uses Nexo, I want to point out a few things that I especially like about their crypto-backed loans. First, when the price of your collateral grows, so does your credit line. Let's say that you borrow against Bitcoin when each Bitcoin is worth $5,000, but over the course of your loan, the price grows to $10,000 per Bitcoin. This means that the size of your credit line just doubled as well. I personally haven't seen anyone else doing this. A second thing that I really like about Nexo is that you only pay interest on the amount that you borrow. I've seen Nexo competitors require you to take out loans and force you to borrow the entire amount. With Nexo, you get a credit line and can borrow only the funds that you need and pay them back whenever you want with interest assessed daily. Again, this isn't something that I've seen other providers do. The final aspect of Nexo I'd like to highlight is that they give you the ability to borrow against a basket of crypto assets. For example, if you post BTC, ETH, and BNB as collateral to your Nexo account, the Nexo Oracle calculates the real-time market value of those assets and adjusts your credit line accordingly. To my knowledge, other providers in this space only allow you to borrow against one asset per loan. Finally, this episode is also brought to you by the startup that produces it, Nomics.com. Nomics is a crypto market cap website and aggregator going head-to-head with CoinMarketCap. We stand as a transparent alternative to many of the sketchy market cap websites out there. We won't name names, but I think you know who we're referring to. Anyway, if you haven't been to Nomics.com in a while, I encourage you to visit our website. We offer transparent volume statistics for nearly every cryptocurrency and crypto exchange in the space. And I believe we have the only credible crypto exchange index in the space at the time of this recording. If you're sick of scammy ads, bad design, and manipulated data provided by companies whose founders hide from public view, then check us out at nomics.com. Okay, back to Hasu.
Mining sounds really useful, right? But it's also costly. So why do miners do this? They do this because we, the network, incentivize them to do so with block rewards. Block rewards is the block subsidy and transaction fees. This mining of blocks is also how Bitcoin distributes its coins initially to the world. Right? So any new currency needs a way to distribute units. And generally speaking, mining works like an auction. For every block miners get to append to the blockchain, they get new coins. If they are smart, then they will bid in this auction with their computing power, but they won't bid more than the coin is worth to them. There's always some kind of balance there. So there are coins to get for them, and they start hashing. And by doing that, they establish a consistent state. And that state has value to users. So this is the economic feedback loop of mining. But I thought Bitcoin was secured by cryptography. I feel so cheated, right? It's dirty humans behind the curtain all over again. You could cry out. And this is totally true. Bitcoin is secured by people basically setting financial incentives and other people responding to these incentives. If someone has told you the blockchain is the truth machine and all that jazz, then yeah, it's pretty much not true.
I think that's a really good point. Everyone talks about how Bitcoin is money backed by math. And that's true, but it's also backed by people building and powering machines that use math. So the economic components of what's underpinning the success of Bitcoin is, I think it's appreciated, but it's just not talked about a lot. So it's a solid point.
If you react anything like me after hearing this, then you would think to yourself, how can we possibly know this is secure? Right? Well, luckily, there's a study of incentives and strategic situations, and it's called game theory.
With that, let's transition to chapter 3, game theory, and why it's a useful lens through which to examine the incentives behind proof of work mining. Hasu, what is game theory, and what does it tell us about Bitcoin mining?
And game theory is the way to look how people behave in certain situations when they know their outcome depends on what other people do. So there's some kind of strategic interaction between different parties. This is what we want to understand, right? We want to know if and how mining is secure. And for that, we have to know how miners and users react to the incentives that they create for each other. Typically, in game theory, assume that people are rational, right? So, and that just means they react, they do what's best for them. And that can really mean all kinds of things. So rationality does not mean you maximize for money. It just means you maximize for what is important to you. And that's really a fine framework, in my opinion, because you can represent everything under that umbrella, right? There's a very famous quote by Charlie Munger. He said, "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." And then this is not always true, but remarkably often so. And it is also the best we can do, because we are left with this system where the state is established by economic incentives. There's not really a known way to replace that, right? So even all the new systems, even proof of stake and all the other consensus algorithms that we have not touched on, they all depend on incentives, setting incentives for the block producers in the system. This is unlikely to be ever replaced by math or cryptography. When we think about game theory, then we try to model real situations as games, and we leave out everything that we don't need, right? So we acknowledge the real world is incredibly complex, but sometimes it's possible to reduce a strategic situation that might seem really complex at first to just a few key parameters. And when we manage that, then we can actually make it much easier to reason about. So these parameters typically are: who are the players? What are their options? When do they act in relation to each other? So do they act sequentially or simultaneously? And what are the payoffs from their interaction? The players in our case are the miners. So miners first have to decide which transactions to include in their block. They can include any transaction they want. They can exclude particular transactions of people they don't like. They can even include no transactions at all. And how could you possibly prevent this with cryptography, right? It's not possible to prove that a miner has actually seen a transaction. Second, he has to decide which previous block header hash to reference. And this determines where their block will be appended. So if I reference the most recent known block, then my new block will extend that chain. And so it will extend the already longest chain. But I could also ignore that block. I can also reference my own most recent block, right? Even though it might not be the most recent one. Or I can even reference a very old block. So this is what's happening typically when we talk about 51% attacks, where miners, they start out by referencing a block that's maybe 4, 5 blocks in the past. And then they mine 10, 20 blocks faster than anyone else. And then they publish these blocks all at once and present a longer chain. And because of the chain selection rule, the other miners in the network would switch to that chain. And that chain could include double spans, right? Could include basically anything.
Hey, this is Clay cutting in from the editor's booth to explain a bit more about 51% attacks. Once an actor controls more than 50% of the hash power of a network, they can get away with double spending. In other words, they can spend Bitcoin by going back to an earlier block and using their superior computing power to quickly build a new longest chain that doesn't include the spent transaction. And because it's the longest chain, the other miners will recognize it as being the definitive chain, even though it doesn't include the spent Bitcoin. This enables the bad actor to spend the same Bitcoin again, or double spend. In 2018, Bitcoin Gold suffered a 51% attack that cost the network an equivalent of $18 million. Okay, back to the show.
And finally, their payoffs. So the payoffs, we typically look at them as rewards minus costs. And on the cost side, we have miners, no matter what other decisions they make, but if they hash, then they incur real world costs, both in terms of fixed costs. They have to buy hardware, right? They have to get a place to put the hardware. They probably need engineers. They need access to energy, and they are rewarded for mining with tokens from block rewards. Then they can also extract rent from being a temporary dictator over what transactions to include. So the block that they make, they can do anything they want with it. All of these rewards miners get only if their block is included in the main chain. So it really depends on the actions of the other miners and users, which leads us to the idea of Nash equilibrium. So Nash equilibrium is a game state in a game where no player can unilaterally improve their outcome. And Satoshi had such an equilibrium. So we will call it honest mining, because that ensures the best outcome for users. It goes as follows. So miners include the highest paying transactions, meaning they don't censor any transactions, and they always reference the already longest chain. So they don't go back in time. They don't reference any past blocks to double spend. They don't mine empty blocks. They just do what Satoshi wanted them to do. We can use game theory to look at how well mining actually implements this and what factors it depends on. Mallory sends a transaction to miners that she has already spent before. She's attempting to double spend. And our miner has to decide if we should include her transaction in his block. Let's look at what happens. So the miner definitely incurs a cost, right? No matter if his block is accepted by the network or not, he incurs a cost. And what happens next? Let's assume he includes the invalid transaction. And the other miners and nodes, he broadcasts the block. It's picked up by other nodes and miners. They run it against their validity rules, and they see that it contains an invalid transaction. And that makes the whole block invalid. So they reject it, and all the work done by our miner was wasted. And this is true for all blocks with insufficient proof of work, anything that includes invalid transactions. And there's really no point in doing this at all. This just shows us that some strategic options, they always suck, no matter what, and they should be minimized at all costs.
Let's transition to chapter 4, which is our Q&A. In this section, we'll cover several topics, including Bitcoin maximalism, declining block rewards, how China dominated Bitcoin mining, and the professionalization of online poker. Are you personally a Bitcoin maximalist, or it just strikes me that as the block reward approaches zero over time, there could be an appeal to Ethereum or Monero or some of these systems that will never stop granting some kind of block reward to miners. Of course, Ethereum's moving to proof of stake. Do you consider yourself a Bitcoin maximalist?
Bitcoin has such a large head start and is in such a good position. I would say that I believe the most by far in the success of Bitcoin. But not for any ideological reasons, I would say.
So, in a scenario where Bitcoin continues to be one of the best performing assets of all time, and the transaction fees are meaningful, how would you summarize the major risk around the reduction of miner fees? How does that play out in your view? And what should be done? I mean, it's kind of the idea that there should only be 21 million Bitcoin is so sacred that to even question that, would sort of incur the ire of much of crypto Twitter. How would you summarize the vulnerability? Do you have a proposal for what should be done?
We touched on this, but the decision for miners, what block to mine on and what transactions to include and so on, it really depends on cost reward calculation for them. And if the reward for appending blocks to the longest chain is really low, then I think we would see much more frequently double spend attacks at the chain tip, for example. That's one thing that I would expect we will see. And the result from this is that basically right now you can look at basically one confirmation. Bitcoin is incredibly secure. But if the sum of future block rewards is very low, then this money that the miners have basically at stake, their vested interest in the network is really low. That's when attacks become more likely. And as a result of that, we no longer can look at transactions as secure after one block, maybe not even after 10 blocks. Maybe people in 10 years will say, oh, you have to wait 20 blocks before your transaction is final. And that's the result of how little revenue the miners get and how little they have at stake to protect the network. This can have pretty bad effects, right? So if users have to wait 20 blocks for their transactions to finalize, then what will that do to demand? Then suddenly people don't want to hold Bitcoin anymore. It's not their preferred medium of exchange. There's even less transactions. So you get into this kind of, I think the term death spiral is really overused, but in this case, I think it really applies because people today don't realize that they say Bitcoin has all these magic assurances, and it's so secure. But what secures Bitcoin? It is secure because we spend a lot of money to secure it. And the moment we stop spending a lot of money for its security, then miners will have a smaller vested interest in protecting the network. And together with that, the assurances that we so value today will disappear also. And what does that do to demand? Again, demand might be even lower, leading to even less fees, to even less future block rewards, to even weaker assurances, to even less demand, and so on. So you really get into a very problematic cycle there.
Do you think there is a solution other than uncapping the supply?
We made a case for uncapping the supply or instituting some kind of tax on the system. I realized that this is highly contentious politically. And we just kind of did it to show how we think about the system from like the perspective of a mechanism designer. So if you want to design a very sustainable, very robust system, then you would use basically a tax or a permanent issuance because it has this very nice property that the money that is dedicated to secure your system, it scales directly with the size of that system. So if the price of Bitcoin doubles, then the money that is basically reserved for, that is paid to miners doubles as well, right? In real purchasing power. So this is a really, really nice property. And you guarantee this property to yourself, even if you have this kind of tax on all users. And even if that leads to lower demand, that's fine because, the system will just find a new equilibrium at a lower price. And then basically you also pay less for security. It's always politically very easy to lower the issuance rate, but it is incredibly difficult to increase it. So better start a bit on the safer side, and then you can lower it if you think the system is too secure than ever going in the other direction.
Christine asked, what impact does innovations to mining technology making block production more efficient have on the equilibrium and incentives of the Bitcoin system?
First, hardware tends to get more efficient over time, right? So this is true. This is true for any endeavor that humans make, pretty much. So if there's money to be made, then we are smart and innovative. Then we try to do better. We research new technology and ways to do the same thing better. And just whatever we do, any industry, it gets way more optimized over time. And the same is true for mining. We started with CPU mining. Later, we had a long phase of GPU mining, and eventually we moved entirely to application-specific circuits, which is where we are now. And now there's even chips get ever smaller, and now there's immersion cooling and whatnot, and probably also innovations in other areas like miner mobility. So I think in the future, mining farms will be more mobile than they are today. So miners can better make use of regional energy costs, pretty much. So if there's somewhere in the world, if there's like an oversupply of energy, then basically miners will relocate there. The result of that is, of course, that the more and more hashes will be produced. Well, the difficulty keeps increasing in the network, and if some miners improve and others don't, then the miners who do improve will get a larger share of the pie, and the miners who don't will fall by the wayside. So this is really a very competitive business. And the specialization has another large benefit. Actually, has two large benefits. So the first large benefit is that the more specialized Bitcoin mining is, the harder Bitcoin is to attack with general purpose technology. So if you look at how Bitcoin Gold, Vergecoin, these CPU mined coins, even Ethereum Classic have been attacked, it was with, they all have general purpose mining technology because they believe in the idea of ASIC resistance. But the end result is unfortunately that anyone can rent hash power online on general computing marketplaces like Amazon Web Services, or there are even some specific cloud mining marketplaces like NiceHash. They can rent the hash power that is necessary and just attack these networks without having any vested interest in them at all. And this is, of course, very different to how we showed Bitcoin works, because in Bitcoin, miners have to go deep into debt to the network. They have to incur very large upfront costs because there's no way to rent hash power. And also because there's no way to sell this hardware once you're done with it. It's not just the tangible assets of the mining industry, also the intangible assets like knowledge, right? Intellectual property, knowing how to run a highly, highly specialized mining operation. All of these are assets for the mining space that would become useless if Bitcoin ever disappeared.
I have a question around incentives for miners. So if you want to participate in the upside of the Bitcoin network and the prices increasing over time, probably the easiest way is just to purchase Bitcoin. You don't have to deal with the logistics of getting access to a lot of power. You don't have to worry about racks and racks of ASICs, etc. So that sort of begs the question, what are the incentives for someone to mine? And how are those incentives distributed geographically?
If you talk about the incentives of mining, we have to talk about the $4 to $5 billion a year that Bitcoin pays to its miners. So this is really the pie that is distributed between miners, and the block reward will halve this year. So the reward that miners get, but still it's a very large sum of money. It's a very good question why mining has been so focused in China historically. I think I'm not an expert on this topic, but I give you my guess. So I think this is a somewhat largely a cultural thing, I would say. So basically the US has been very focused on making software, but they kind of forgot how to make hardware. So this is something that China has been very big in, right, for the last decades already. So it was kind of natural for them to discover Bitcoin mining as well. And all the specialized, some of the foundries are in China, and some of the big hardware makers are also in China. And of course, once you have that kind of infrastructure there, then this kind of gives the local miners a certain benefit, right? Because shorter supply chains, shorter maintenance, there's more local knowledge for how to operate these machines. Also, China has a lot of cheap electricity. China for some time was very big in the refining of aluminum. This is the single most electricity intensive work that exists, to my knowledge. All aluminum refineries are built next to places where you have an abundance cheap electricity, because this is really a way to export electricity, right? So you have this cheap electricity, for example, from a hydro dam, you convert it into aluminum as an input. So the electricity is an input to the aluminum, but it keeps its value, and then you export it to another country that has higher electricity costs. And this is something that China was very big in, and that the Scandinavian countries in Europe are also very big in the refining of aluminum. But the price of aluminum and the demand from the world market crashed pretty hard, I think, in the 2000s. And as a result of that, several large refineries had to close down, but the hydro dams are still there. And if you have this kind of infrastructure in place, it's very hard to transport electricity from one place to another. It's typically consumed where it's created, or it's very close to it. This is really a hotbed for Bitcoin miners, right?
Are you still doing online poker? Are you trading as part of your research activities? What kind of caused you to make the transition? It's very clear from the rigor of the work that you do that it's time consuming, that a great deal of discovery goes into it. Even just taking blockchain data and organizing it in such a manner where you can ask interesting questions, or at least novel questions. It's getting easier over time, but there's still a lot of work to do there. What made you make the switch, and are you doing research full time or other things as well?
I'm pretty much done with poker entirely. I kept doing what I like doing most, which is teaching. I'm still involved with some other players and give them advice, mostly these days on how to learn. It's not so much more that I give direct strategic advice, more how to study best, this kind of stuff. And the main reason I quit, to be honest, is because it was no longer profitable. So poker is very much like mining in that it gets so much harder every year. So there's a very big noticeable difference because there's a limited amount of money to go around, and players are very crafty. So they do anything they can to get better, stay on the treadmill instead of falling off. They develop custom software. They hire people to work for them. It's really highly professionalized. Nowadays, I would say any player that plays on the highest stakes in poker, so any professional player, right? He probably has a team behind him of people who just work for his success, right? And participate in his bottom line. So it's just like professional sports. It is a complete team of effort. And by now, and it's interdisciplinary. So you have game theorists, you have software developers, and the players themselves are definitely more like athletes who really need to watch out for their constitution, their nutrition. They need to study a lot, right? So back in the day, you could get away with just playing most of the time. And nowadays, I would say there's probably more like a 3-to-1 ratio, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 ratio between studying and playing. So for every hour that you play, probably study 3 to 4 hours. So it's really that kind of intensity. It's really at the level of pro sports, I would say, by now.
Last question. If you could wave a magic wand and altruistically do something for the crypto space immediately, what would it be?
Oh my. I don't know. I would stay true to my character and say to think about that.
So CZ, when I interviewed him, he said that every government with a fiat currency would issue, it's kind of blockchain based, they digitize their money supplies. Someone talked about regulatory clarity, your proposal on uncapping the supply of Bitcoin. There is a very religious element to the Bitcoin community, but I also think it's really helpful to take a pragmatic approach and think about what is actually best for the space. That's probably something that should be in the running. I think at the very least, it'd be great if people were a bit more data-driven and pragmatic when it comes to debates in the space versus a lot of the acrimonious back and forth that happens in crypto Twitter, which gets me down some days. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I think you raise a very good point. I think if it's something around these lines, so I would definitely not use that wish to dictate any kind of proposal or solution, because that just defeats the point of Bitcoin, in my opinion. It's not Bitcoin if it's not consensus. But I would like if more people engage with the problem, right? So I don't claim to have any answers myself. I just think there's a problem and more people should be looking at it.
Well, that concludes my conversation with Hasu. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I want to invite you to subscribe to our newsletter called Popular Crypto. With the Popular Crypto newsletter, we don't cover token hype or announcements of announcements. Instead, the Popular Crypto newsletter focuses on the mainstream products and services taking crypto to the masses. To subscribe to the Popular Crypto newsletter, go to popularcrypto.news, enter your email address, and subscribe. Again, that's popularcrypto.news. All right, that wraps up things for this week. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Until then, take care. That's it for this week. To sign up for our free crypto investing newsletter, listen to other episodes, or get the show notes from this episode, please visit flippening.com. I also invite you to check out the startup that funds this podcast, Nomics, spelled Nomics, at nomics.com. Finally, if you got value from the show, the biggest thing you can do to help us out is to leave a 5-star review with some comments and feedback on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.